Hello and welcome to another DazToHue tips and tricks video. This video is in part a remake of the first tips and tricks video where I talked about how we can paint attributes onto the character to govern which parts of it get retained or deleted on the occlusion node. In addition to that, we'll also take a look at the two other areas in the DazToHue workflow where attribute painting is applicable. You might recall in the first tips and tricks video I showed a method whereby we would split off parts of the geometry that we wanted to paint attributes on and then merge them back together again. Now in most scenarios that method of splitting and merging the geometry will work fine, but I have come across an edge case where by doing that we are actually affecting the overall point count and therefore breaking the joint corrective morph generation part of the workflow. And that's something we obviously want to prevent from happening. So with the help of the side effects forum, I have come up with a new method of achieving the same result, but doesn't have that risk of changing the point counts. So to just recap the old method and to show why it can break things, I'll just quickly recreate it. So if you recall, we started with a split node, and we would split off the part of the character that we wanted to paint on. In this case, the body. We would then drop down an attribute paint node, and then we would merge the body back with the clothing. Like that. Now in this particular scenario, as I say, it will work. It won't affect the overall point count. The reason for that is that the body that we are splitting off is made up of a single connected piece of geometry. So if I take a look at that under here, this 3D connected geometry option, so I can hover over it and we'll see that just by hovering over the body, it's highlighting the entire body is one single piece of connected geometry. And at the end of the merge, the entire body is still one single piece of connected geometry. To demonstrate where this process can fall apart, if instead of selecting the body, let's just say I selected the skirt part of the character's clothing, so just this part. Actually, before doing that, you'll see that the whole dress is made up again of one single connected piece of geometry. But if I just split off the skirt and then merge them back together again, you'll see it's no longer one single connected piece of geometry, it's now two pieces of geometry. And when I think about it, that makes complete sense, because while we are merging them back together into a single data stream, they aren't actually getting fused back into a single piece of geometry. This means that we now have double the point and vertex count along these edges here where they connect. Now, obviously Houdini has tools for fusing them back together again, but in addition to that, we would also need to make sure that the point order remains unchanged, and that's getting a little too complicated, and I really wanted to keep this workflow as simple as possible. So I think going forward, it's best to not use this split merge method and instead use the method I'm about to show you. So it's a very similar method, but rather than splitting and merging, we are going to rely on the visibility node and basically hiding parts of the character that we don't want to paint onto and then unhiding them at the end. So rather than a split node, I'll put down a visibility node. And on that, the action will be hide primitives, and I'm going to hide the character's clothing. So visually it's the same as if we'd split it off. Now we're going to again drop down an attribute paint node. This one will be, just so we can follow along, I'll rename these. We'll call this hide clothing, and then we'll paint a delete attribute. Now I'm going to copy this hide clothing visibility node, and instead we'll call it show clothing. And the action, rather than hiding primitives, will be exposing primitives. So we now have our clothing back. We'll plug that into the occlusion node. Now, same as we did in the first tips and tricks video, the occlusion node needs integer attributes. So under the attribute, I'll just rename it to delete, although it doesn't matter what it's called. We'll change its type from float to integer. We'll turn on symmetry. Now on the occlusion node itself, I will enable occlusion culling. In this delete attribute dropdown, I will select our delete attribute. Now, one critical path in this workflow and getting it to work is that on the attribute paint node itself, under the brush options, we want to make sure that visible only is ticked, and we also want to increase this visibility bias all the way up to 1. Now, even though the clothing is still visible, I should be able to paint through it onto just the body and not paint the clothing itself. So with our attribute paint node selected, if I hover over the viewport and hit enter, we'll enter paint mode. Again, I can control the size of my brush. In this case, I will use a surface brush. Now, if I start painting, we should see the parts that I'm painting be deleted, which they are. And in the interest of, I guess, completion, the other node, the other attribute that we can paint and pass to the occlusion node is a retain attribute. If I copy and paste, our delete attribute paint node, this one I'll call paint retain attribute. We'll reset its changes. Under the attribute, I'll rename it from delete to retain. On our occlusion node, under retain attribute, I will select our retain attribute. Now if I select the attribute paint node for the retain attribute, and again if I start painting, I should see those polygons come back. And just to recap, this method of showing and hiding rather than splitting and merging shouldn't ever result in the overall point count changing, because we aren't actually interfering with any geometry on a topology level. So this is by far a better method of doing things. So now that we've explored the new method of painting on selected parts of the geometry, I'll quickly talk about the other two locations where painting attributes can come in handy. So the next one is on the mesh node. You might recall, I think it was the third tutorial video I did on DazToHue. I did briefly touch on this. But to recap, the DazToHue mesh node allows us to perform either subdivisions or poly reduction operations on either the entire character or part of it. When it comes to poly reduction operations, there is a way to pass in an attribute that we've painted on the character, which will tell the mesh node that we want to retain more topology in that particular area. So to demonstrate that, I will enable mesh operations, and I'll add a new mesh operation. It will be a reduction, and I'm going to, in this case, pick the entire character's body. You'll see by default it does a pretty aggressive poly reduction. In this case, I will untick this continue reducing within quality tolerance, and I will just set, say, 50% of the incoming polygons as the target. So we're now basically halved the number of polygons on our character's body. Now, if we scroll down to the bottom of the options here, you'll see we have this retain density by attribute section. And as I said, that allows us to pass in an attribute which will tell the poly reduction node under the hood that we want to keep more mesh density in the areas we've painted. Now in this case I'm only going to paint on the character's face, so I don't really need to hide any clothing. If you did need to paint under the clothing on a part of the character's body, you could again use this visibility setup that we've demonstrated before. But in this case I don't need it. I'm just going to drop down another attribute paint node and we'll connect it up. I'll call this one paint density. Oops. Now this attribute needs to be a float because it will take values in between 0 and 1, which means you can sort of smooth out the values. So unlike the occlusion node, which is either a value of 0 or 1, this attribute can be values in between 0 and 1, so hence a float. I'll call the attribute density. I will enable mirroring and I'll keep the brushes volume in this case. I'll talk about the different brushes in a little bit. So now I'm going to paint on the character's face because I want to preserve more topology around the character's facial features, I guess. And if I hold down Shift, I can smooth out that transition. Now back on our mesh node, under this retain density by attribute, I can enable that and select our density attribute. Now I can use this weight slider to control how much of that topology density it's preserving in the areas I've painted. So that's all there is really to getting that working. Now the final example of where we can use attribute painting to control things is with the pose asset node, and I haven't ever talked about this one before. So on the pose asset node itself, we have this visualize JCM mask option. Now the JCM mask feature was introduced, I think release 0.2, I can't remember. And it was introduced to deal with a scenario I talked about, I think again in the third tutorial video, where on Genesis 8.1 figures, when the character was put into certain poses, I would see these little micro spikes of vertices, particularly around the character's tear line here, but also elsewhere on the character. And these micro spikes are coming from DazToHue. I don't know why. It doesn't happen on Genesis 9 figures. I can only assume that when morphs were being created for Genesis 8.1 and 8 figures, there was just, I guess, some precision issues around either transferring the geometry to another application to actually paint the, to sculpt the morphs or something like that. I'm not too sure. But nevertheless, the JCM mask feature was introduced to deal with that. Now, I haven't used it on any of the videos I've put up since. It's probably only really applicable if you plan on doing sort of super close-ups of Genesis 8.1 figures. You might notice it, but for the most part it's not noticeable. So the JCM mask function lets us basically mask out parts of the geometry where corrective morphs won't be applied. So if a point has a value of 1 for its JCM mask, no corrective morphs will be applied to that point. If it has a value of 0, and then 100% of the corrective morph will be applied to that point. And we can sort of have a gradient between 1 and 0 to sort of smooth out where that transition is happening. Now, as I said, it was originally introduced to deal primarily around the eye section, and so I added this mask group option, which on Genesis 8.1 figures allows us to, for example, just select the eye sockets, and it will automatically mask out that area around the tear line for us, and so no corrective morphs will be applied to this tear line. And we can control the size of that and also the smoothness of the transition. But rather than using this mask group, we can actually, again, just paint an attribute onto the character and pass that in as the mask. And I recently, when I was working on the last video, came across a scenario where I did need to do that. And without getting too sidetracked, I will talk a little bit about that scenario. So what I wanted to do was have cloth simulation on the lower half of the character's dress here. So this skirt section would be cloth simulated in Unreal Engine, and therefore it wouldn't have any corrective morphs applied to it. But I did want to keep corrective morphs on the top part of the dress, so around the shoulders and areas like that, so that the arm deformation would look correct. Now, in order to get it all working in Unreal Engine so that there was no tearing along this seam between the cloth simulated section and the corrective morph driven section, so the bottom and the top of the dress, two things were needed. One is that on the cloth simulation inside Unreal Engine, I needed to make sure that the top row of vertices at least was not getting simulated. So by painting a density value of 0 in Unreal Engine when painting the cloth densities. But I also needed to ensure that no corrective morphs were interfering with the bottom part of this bodice section of the dress, because I didn't want corrective morphs to shift the position of these last row of vertices on this top section, because I didn't want, again, any visible seam or seam tearing happening here. And so the way to do that was to paint a JCM mask along this seam, basically, for both the dress and the body underneath it. And the body is optional, but in order to try and minimize any chance of the body poking through, I masked out both the dress and the body in this section. So I'm going to show you two ways of doing this. One is easier and works, I think, if the clothing is quite close to the body underneath. In this case, it is. That method, we don't need the visibility setup that we have used up here. We can just get away with a single attribute paint node. I'll call it JCM mask. Connect it up. Like the mesh density mask, this one also needs to be a float because it will accept values in between 0 and 1. So under the attribute tab, I'll leave it as with a name of mask, and we'll leave it with an attribute type of float. And we'll turn on symmetry. Now, just to briefly talk about the brush options on the attribute paint node. If we set it to surface, it will just paint on the first surface it hits. So in this case, that will be the clothing, and that stroke isn't going to penetrate through to the character's body. In this case, I want to paint on both the clothing and the body. So if I set the shape type to volume, you'll see it becomes a 3D sphere, whereas the surface one was just a 2D circle. So with the volume method, if the distance between the clothing and the body is short enough that this sphere will penetrate through to the body, then we will be able to paint on both the clothing and the body at the same time. So if I carefully peer underneath the clothing, it might be difficult to see. We can see now that we have painted on the character's body as well. The other option, brush option that could work is screen. Screen will paint again through all of the geometry. So it'll paint onto the clothing and anything behind it, but it works in screen space, so it's a little tricky perhaps to control where you're actually painting on the other side. So if I painted here, for example, with the screen brush on, you'll notice that we're painted through the other side, and it may or may not be in the area we wanted. So it depends on the angle you're painting at. So if I was to paint looking from this way, for example, you'll see, because it's in screen space, we're painting all the way up here, which we don't want. We could, if I reset those, we could also turn on front face only, and that will, I think, prevent that. So now if I paint here, you can see we're not necessarily painting on the back, although we are painting on some of these wrinkles here because they are forward facing. But we will have painted on the body underneath as well, which is good. So I guess the brush type you use depends on your clothing, how far away it is from the geometry, etc., etc. In order to get super precise, again, we can use this show hide method to get very granular control over where we're painting. So again, for example, if I drop down a visibility node, and in this case, I will try to do this a way that I don't get in trouble for nudity. In this case, we will hide the clothing. I'll go back to my surface brush, and now we can just paint on the body where we want that JCM mask to occur. And I already smooth it out so that transition is smoother. Now once we're finished painting on the body, we could show the clothing again. So expose the clothing again. And then we can copy and paste our attribute paint node. And then this time ensuring that we're using the surface brush so we don't paint through the clothing. I can just paint onto the clothing. Again, just smooth out that transition. And so now we have, with two separate attribute paint nodes, painted accurately onto the character's body. And then in the second attribute paint node, once we've hidden the clothing, we're painting onto the clothing. Now because they are both using the same attribute name, mask, they will get added together. So now on our pose asset node, we have this mask attribute option, so I can use the drop down and select our mask attribute, and that will show everywhere on both the body and the clothing that that mask has been applied. It's a little difficult to see. I'll carefully try and peer under the clothing. We can see that we still have that value painted on the body as well as the clothing. So hopefully that made sense. If not, give me a shout out on the Discord server and I'll try to explain further. But those are the three current parts of the DazToHue workflow where attribute painting is applicable. So just to recap, we can paint integer attributes and pass those to the occlusion node to determine which parts of the character we delete or retain in our occlusion operations. We can paint a float attribute and pass that to the mesh node to determine which parts of the character's topology we want to preserve detail around. And finally, we can paint a JCM mask attribute, which is also a float attribute, to determine which parts of the mesh get corrective morphs applied to them or not. So that's all for this video. I'll see you in the next one.